On my 70th birthday, I received a box. No card, no warmth. Just a cold message scribbled in icing. Happy birthday, Linda. But I knew that handwriting. I raised that boy for 30 years. My own son sent it. I couldn't eat it, not with my health. So I handed it over to the one person who was nearby, his mother-in-law. What I didn't know was that cake nearly killed us both. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of my revenge stories. Birthdays used to mean something in my family. My late husband would decorate the living room with balloons every single year without fail. The red ones were always my favorite. He remembered that even after 43 years of marriage. My son would call first thing in the morning, sometimes even before sunrise, his voice bright with excitement. "Happy birthday, Mama," he'd sing through the phone. "What time should I come over with your surprise?" My daughter-in-law would insist on baking my favorite lemon pie from scratch, using my mother's old recipe that I'd taught her when she first joined our family. She'd arrive with flour still dusting her apron, her smile genuine and warm. Those were the days when being 70 felt like a celebration, not a burden. But this year was different. No call in the morning, no flowers, no warm laughter echoing through my home. The silence of my phone was louder than any insult I'd ever received. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one my husband had bought me for our 20th anniversary, and watched the morning light creep across the hardwood floors. I brewed my tea, the same Earl Grey I'd been drinking for decades, staring at the clock on the mantelpiece. 10 o'clock came and went. The phone didn't ring. 11 o'clock. Still nothing. By noon, I found myself checking if the phone was even working, dialing the time just to hear a voice on the other end. The automated recording felt like the only acknowledgement I'd received that day. I tried to busy myself with small tasks, watering the African violets on my windowsill, folding the laundry that had been sitting in the basket for 2 days. But every few minutes, my eyes drifted back to that silent phone. I even considered calling them myself, but pride held my fingers back from the keypad. If they had forgotten, I wouldn't remind them. If they were testing me, I wouldn't fail. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. My heart leapt. Maybe they'd planned a surprise after all. Maybe they were just running late. Maybe they had something special waiting for me. I straightened my dress, ran my fingers through my silver hair, and hurried to the door as fast as my 70-year-old legs could carry me. I opened the door to find a delivery man in a wrinkled uniform, sweat beading on his forehead from the afternoon heat. A plain white box sat in his hands. No ribbon, no card, no note. Not even a proper bakery box, just a generic cardboard container. "Delivery for Linda Williams," he muttered, not even looking up from his clipboard. The casual indifference in his voice told me everything I needed to know about the care that had gone into this delivery. I signed with trembling fingers, my chest tightening with a strange mix of hope and dread. The man turned and walked away without another word, leaving me standing in my doorway with this mysterious package. I closed the door slowly and carried the box to my kitchen table, the same table where my family had shared countless birthday breakfasts over the years. I opened the box slowly, as if it might explode. Inside sat a small cake, barely enough to serve 4 people. Not festive, not warm, just cold, heavy icing that looked like it had been applied with more anger than love. The cake itself was store-bought, the kind you find in the discount section of a grocery store. Across the top, in shaky handwriting that I would recognize in my sleep, it read, "Happy birthday, Linda." That handwriting. I knew it anywhere. My son's penmanship, the same loops and slants I'd helped him practice when he was 7 years old. The same handwriting that had signed Mother's Day cards for decades. The same script that had written, "I love you, Mama," on countless childhood drawings. Now it looked rushed, careless, like an afterthought. My heart sank deeper than I thought possible. That was it? No visit, no hug, no phone call to wish me well. Just this insult wrapped in sugar and delivered like a pizza order. I set the cake on the counter next to the African violets, and immediately my phone buzzed with a text message. My daughter-in-law's name flashed on the screen. Hope you got the cake. We're busy tonight. Maybe next week we can celebrate. My hands shook as I read the words again and again. Busy tonight? My 70th birthday. The milestone birthday I'd been anticipating for months. And I was brushed aside like a stranger asking for spare change. Maybe next week? As if birthdays were interchangeable. As if turning 70 was something that could be postponed for convenience. I typed back, my fingers stiff with anger and hurt. Thank you for the cake. I'll enjoy it. But deep inside, I knew I couldn't. Not with my health. My doctor had warned me just weeks ago during my quarterly checkup. Linda, you need to stay away from too much sugar. Your diabetes is getting worse, and your body simply can't handle the glucose spikes anymore. He'd been stern, more serious than I'd ever seen him. One slice of cake could put you in the hospital. I stared at that pathetic excuse for a birthday cake for hours. Its sweetness mocked me from across the kitchen. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still no phone call, no visit, no acknowledgement that this day meant anything to anyone. I walked through my empty house, past the family photos that lined the hallway walls. Pictures of birthday parties from years past, all smiles and laughter and genuine joy. My son as a teenager, grinning as he presented me with a homemade card. My daughter-in-law in her early 30s, her arm around my shoulders as we posed with a beautiful cake she'd baked herself. When had it all changed? When had I become invisible to the people I loved most? And then, an idea struck like lightning in my chest. A terrible, beautiful idea that made my heart race and my hands stop shaking. Later that evening, the family gathered. Not for me, but for their weekly dinner at my son's house. It was a tradition that had started years ago, every Sunday night, the extended family coming together. I was invited as an afterthought, the way you might invite a neighbor out of politeness. The call had come around 6 o'clock. My daughter-in-law's voice was casual, almost bored. Oh, Linda, we're having dinner tonight. You can come if you want. Nothing special, just family. Nothing special. On my 70th birthday. I brought the cake with me, carrying it carefully in my hands like it was made of glass. When I walked into their dining room, I was struck by how beautiful everything looked. The table was set with their good china, the kind they only used for important occasions. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase, roses and lilies that must have cost a fortune. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting a warm glow over the room. It was elegant, thoughtful, expensive. Everything my birthday celebration hadn't been. When I set the cake on the sideboard, my daughter-in-law raised an eyebrow, her expression flickering between confusion and annoyance. Oh, you brought it here? Her tone suggested I'd committed some sort of social faux pas, like bringing a pet to a formal dinner. Yes, I said softly, my voice steady but my heart racing like a hummingbird's wings. I thought we could share it. Since it's my birthday, I added quietly, watching her face for any sign of remembrance. Her eyes flickered for just a second. Something sharp, something nervous, like a deer caught in headlights. Then she forced a smile that looked painful to maintain. Of course. Let's have it after dinner. But I saw her exchange a quick glance with my son, a look loaded with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. Dinner itself was a masterclass in small humiliations, each one delivered with surgical precision. My chair was the wobbly one in the corner, the one with the loose leg that made me feel unstable throughout the meal. Everyone else sat in the good chairs, the ones with proper cushions and solid construction. My glass was chipped along the rim, the only damaged piece among a set of otherwise perfect crystal. When I pointed it out, my daughter-in-law shrugged. "Oh, that old thing. I keep meaning to throw it away." My son barely spoke to me throughout the entire meal, his attention focused entirely on his wife's family. He laughed at their jokes, asked about their jobs, complimented the outfits of his mother-in-law and sister-in-law. When his mother-in-law told a long, rambling story about her garden, he listened with rapt attention. When I tried to share a story about the book I'd been reading, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, he looked at his phone. "Mm-hmm," he murmured without looking up. "That's nice, Mom." The dismissal stung worse than a slap, and when I tried to join in their conversation about vacation plans, my daughter-in-law cut me short with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Linda, you wouldn't understand. It's about investments and tax shelters." She said it like I was a child, like my 70 years of life experience meant nothing. Laughter followed from around the table, not mean-spirited exactly, but not kind either. I sat quietly, my cheeks burning with shame and anger. Finally, dessert time came. The moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating all evening. The cake was placed in the center of the table like a centerpiece. Under the dining room lights, it looked even more pathetic than it had in my kitchen. The icing was uneven, the edges rough, the whole thing slightly lopsided. My son's mother-in-law, a woman I'd known for 15 years, someone who had always been kind to me, leaned forward eagerly. She was a sweet woman, really, with a genuine smile and a generous heart. She'd brought me soup when I had pneumonia 2 winters ago. She'd sent me a beautiful Christmas card every year without fail. She didn't deserve what was about to happen. "Don't mind if I do," she said with enthusiasm, reaching for the cake server. "I haven't had dessert in weeks." She was trying to be cheerful, to make up for her daughter's coldness toward me. I could see it in her eyes, the apologetic look, the extra warmth in her voice. She cut herself a generous piece, the knife making a soft sound as it sliced through the layers. I pushed the plate toward her, my hand steady despite the storm raging in my chest. "Go ahead, enjoy it," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. She took a bite, closing her eyes and humming with appreciation. Surprisingly good. At least they remembered your special day." She was being kind, trying to put a positive spin on the obvious neglect, but her words only made the situation more heartbreaking. I forced a laugh, but my stomach churned with a mixture of guilt and anticipation. Minutes later, her smile faltered. The change was subtle at first. A slight furrowing of her brow, a quick blink of confusion. She pressed her hand to her chest, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I don't feel so good," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and frightened. Gasps filled the room. My son's face went pale as paper. My daughter-in-law dropped her fork with a clatter that seemed to echo forever. "Mom! Mom!" my son's wife cried, rushing to her mother's side. The woman's breathing became labored, her chest rising and falling in irregular patterns. She clutched at her throat, her eyes wide with panic. Within moments, she collapsed forward, her head hitting the table with a sickening thud. Her body convulsed once, twice, then went still. Chaos erupted. Someone shouted for an ambulance while my son fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. My daughter-in-law was screaming, cradling her mother's head, tears streaming down her face. Other family members backed away from the table in horror, staring at the cake like it had suddenly transformed into a snake. And in the midst of all that chaos, one thought screamed in my mind with crystal clarity. That cake wasn't meant for her. It was meant for me. The ambulance's siren faded into the night as they rushed my son's mother-in-law away, the paramedics working frantically to stabilize her vital signs. The living room was left in shambles, spilled drinks pooling on the hardwood floor, half-eaten plates abandoned in panic, scattered napkins stained with tears and fear. The cake sat there in the center of the table like evidence at a crime scene, suddenly looking more sinister than celebratory. I sat there quietly, my hands folded in my lap but trembling underneath the table. My son paced the floor like a caged animal, running his fingers through his hair until it stood up in wild tufts. His wife sat frozen in her chair, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her eyes darting between the cake and me and back again. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my son's footsteps on the hardwood floor. Nobody said it out loud, but I could feel the suspicion hanging in the air like smoke. That cake wasn't just spoiled food. Everyone in that room knew it, even if they couldn't bring themselves to voice the thought. Hours later, after the chaos had died down and the other family members had gone home, my son finally turned to me. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, his face etched with lines I'd never noticed before. "Mom," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you eat any of it?" The question hung between us like a loaded gun. I looked up at him. This man I had raised from infancy, whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose tears I had dried. I shook my head slowly, deliberately. "No, doctor told me to stay away from sweets, remember?" For a split second, his shoulders slumped in what looked unmistakably like disappointment, not relief. Not the reaction of a son grateful that his mother had been spared. The reaction of someone whose plan had gone horribly wrong. And right then, in that moment of terrible clarity, my heart knew the truth that my mind had been trying to deny. That cake had been meant for me. My own son, the baby I had carried for 9 months, the child I had nursed through fevers and nightmares, had tried to poison me. The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd opened that deadly cake just 24 hours earlier. It felt like a lifetime had passed. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't escape the loop of realization that kept playing in my mind. The casual delivery, the lack of celebration, the convenient excuse about being too busy. It had all been part of a plan. A plan to make my death look accidental, like the unfortunate result of an old woman's sweet tooth and failing health. I sat there staring at the phone, waiting for someone, anyone, to call and explain what had happened, to offer some innocent explanation that would make sense of the nightmare. Finally, around 10 in the morning, it buzzed. My son's voice crackled through the line, too calm, too measured, like he had practiced what he was going to say. "So, how are you feeling, Mom? You okay after last night?" The casualness of his tone made my blood run cold. This wasn't the voice of a concerned son checking on his mother after a traumatic evening. This was the voice of someone trying to gauge whether his plan had worked. "Yes," I said softly, testing him. "I'm fine. I didn't touch the cake, remember?" A pause that lasted an eternity. His silence thundered louder than any words he could have spoken. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head, the calculations being made. Then he muttered, almost under his breath, "Did she like it?" My blood turned to ice in my veins. She, his wife's mother, the innocent woman who had taken that first fatal bite. His question wasn't about me, not about my safety, not about my well-being, not about whether I had enjoyed my birthday. He wanted to know if his plan had worked, if the poison had done its job. The fact that it had been the wrong victim seemed almost secondary to him. I forced a chuckle, masking the fire building in my chest. "Oh yes," I lied smoothly. "She enjoyed it very much." He hung up quickly after that. Too quickly. Like a man who had gotten the information he needed and didn't want to risk saying too much. For days, whispers followed me everywhere I went. Neighbors stopped their conversations when I walked by, then resumed them in hushed tones once they thought I was out of earshot. Mrs. Peterson from next door asked why an ambulance had come to my son's house, her eyes bright with curiosity and concern. My church friends whispered about the scene at dinner, their voices heavy with shock and sympathy. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, but no one quite knew how to ask. And yet, from my own family, complete silence. Not one word of apology for the ruined evening. Not one gesture of concern for my feelings. Not even a phone call to check how I was handling the trauma of watching someone collapse at what should have been my birthday celebration. It was like I had become invisible again, except now the invisibility felt deliberate and cruel. I decided to visit the hospital to check on my son's mother-in-law. It seemed like the right thing to do, the human thing to do. She lay pale against the white sheets, her body weak but clinging to life with admirable determination. Tubes and wires connected her to machines that beeped steadily, monitoring every heartbeat and breath. When she saw me, she managed a weak smile. "Linda," she whispered, "thank you for coming." I sat beside her bed, taking her frail hand in mine. "How are you feeling, dear?" "Confused," she admitted. "The doctors keep asking me what I ate, but I keep telling them it was just cake." Just cake. If only it had been that simple. The doctor pulled me aside when I was leaving, his expression grave and professional. "Mrs. Williams," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "This wasn't food poisoning." He lowered his voice even further, forcing me to lean in to hear him. "This was deliberate. There were traces of a toxic substance in her system. Something that doesn't occur naturally in food." I gripped the doorframe for support, my legs suddenly feeling like they might give out beneath me. My head spun with the implications. Deliberate. The word echoed in my skull like a hammer striking an anvil, over and over until it became a drumbeat of certainty. This wasn't some tragic accident caused by spoiled ingredients or poor food handling. This was attempted murder. And if I hadn't pushed that cake toward an innocent woman, it would have been me lying in that hospital bed. Or more likely, me lying in a coffin 6 feet underground. That night, I sat alone in my dining room, staring at the walls my late husband had painted himself 40 years ago. The pictures of birthdays past seemed to mock me from their frames, all those years of genuine celebration and love, now revealed to be a lie. Or perhaps not a lie then, but certainly meaningless now. I wiped away tears that felt both hot and cold on my cheeks. When had I become such a burden to them? When had my existence become something to be eliminated rather than cherished? I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made over the years, working 2 jobs to put my son through college while my husband battled cancer, babysitting their children every weekend so they could have date nights, lending them money for their first house, money I'd never seen again, being available every time they needed someone to pick up their kids from school or cook dinner when they were too busy. And this was how they repaid me? With poison disguised as birthday cake? "They think I'm weak," I whispered to the empty house, my voice growing stronger with each word. "They think age has made me blind and helpless." I stood up slowly, feeling something shift inside me, a transformation from victim to survivor. But they don't know that wisdom never retires, and this time, I'll make them regret underestimating me. The fire in my eyes reflected back at me from the dark window, and for the first time in months, I felt truly alive. The doctor's words haunted me. This was deliberate. I couldn't sleep that night, despite taking the sleeping pills my doctor had prescribed for my anxiety. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cake on the table, the shaky handwriting spelling out what I now knew was meant to be my epitaph. I saw my son's face when I told him I hadn't eaten any. Not relief, not gratitude, but disappointment. I saw his mother-in-law collapsing, an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of their hatred. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I needed proof, real evidence that would stand up in court. because if I was going to destroy them, I was going to do it right. I went back to my son's house the next morning under the pretense of checking in. I wore my most innocent expression and carried a container of homemade soup. My daughter-in-law opened the door, her smile stiff and brittle as old plastic. "Oh, Linda, we weren't expecting you." I could see past her shoulder into the kitchen. The cake plate still sat in the trash bin, covered now with coffee grounds and napkins from breakfast. But there were still crumbs on the plate, still traces of that deadly icing. "I just wanted to bring over some soup," I said, holding up the container with trembling hands. "For your mother. She must be so weak after what happened." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she stepped aside to let me in. "That's thoughtful of you," she said, but her tone suggested she found it anything but thoughtful. I moved slowly through their house, playing the role of the frail old woman they expected me to be. But inside, every nerve was on fire with purpose. While she busied herself in the kitchen, pretending to look for a proper container for the soup, I made my move. I lifted the trash lid as quietly as I could and carefully extracted the plate with its remaining evidence. The icing had hardened overnight, but the crumbs still held the secrets I needed. I wrapped them carefully in a napkin from my purse and slipped the evidence into my handbag. When I turned around, she was watching me from the doorway. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and for a moment we stared at each other in complete understanding. She knew that I knew. "You really shouldn't worry so much, Linda," she said coolly, her voice like ice. "It was probably just old eggs or something." I forced my most innocent smile. "Of course, dear. You're probably right." But we both knew she was lying, and now we both knew that I knew she was lying. The game had officially begun. That evening, I called in an old favor from Richard, a retired chemist from our church. Richard had always been kind to me, especially after my husband died. He'd helped me with small repairs around the house and always made sure I got home safely after evening services. I told him I had a baking experiment gone wrong and needed his expertise to figure out what had made someone so sick. It wasn't entirely a lie, just not entirely the truth either. He invited me to his home laboratory, a converted garage where he still enjoyed tinkering with chemical analysis as a hobby. "Keeps the mind sharp," he'd always said. He studied the crumbs under his equipment, running test after test with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years in professional laboratories. I watched him work, my heart pounding with each new procedure. Finally, after what felt like hours, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Concern mixed with disbelief and something that looked like fear. "Linda," he said slowly, removing his safety glasses. "This isn't food gone bad." He gestured to his computer screen, where colorful charts and graphs displayed the results of his analysis. "This is poison, a specific compound that attacks the cardiovascular system." My knees buckled, and I had to grab the edge of his workbench for support. Strong enough to stop a heart if enough was consumed, especially in someone with underlying health conditions. He looked at me with eyes full of compassion and worry. "Linda, do you know who gave this to you? Because whoever it was, they weren't trying to make you sick. They were trying to kill you." The words hit me like physical blows, even though I'd already suspected the truth. Hearing it confirmed by a professional, seeing it displayed in scientific charts and graphs, made it undeniably real. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "My son." His eyes widened with shock, then softened with pity. "Then you need to be very careful, Linda. Very, very careful." The next day brought another phone call from my son. This time his voice was sharp and impatient, like I was an inconvenience he needed to handle quickly. "Mom, are you planning to make a big deal out of this? Because honestly, accidents happen all the time." Accidents. He was calling attempted murder an accident. Your wife's mother nearly died, I said, testing his reaction. How is that just an accident? He sighed heavily, the sound crackling through the phone line. It was the sigh of someone who found my very existence tiresome. Look, maybe it's time you accepted that. Maybe it should have been you instead. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. What did you say? I whispered, though I'd heard him perfectly. But he had already hung up, leaving me sitting there with the dial tone buzzing in my ear. Maybe it should have been you instead. The words echoed in my mind, confirming every terrible suspicion I'd harbored. My own son, the child I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, sacrificed for in ways he would never understand. Wished I was dead. Not just dead, but dead instead of someone else. As if my life was so worthless that it could be traded for any other. I sat frozen in my chair for a long time, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to that monotonous dial tone. But somewhere in that moment of absolute devastation, something shifted. Humiliation and heartbreak crystallized into something harder, something more dangerous. Rage sharpened into crystal clear purpose. They wanted me gone. They thought I was weak, disposable, useless. They had underestimated me so completely that they'd gotten careless. But I had the proof now. The poison, the handwriting, the recorded phone conversation. Because yes, I had started recording our calls after the first suspicious conversation. And soon, everyone else would know exactly what kind of monsters they really were. For the next few days, I played my role perfectly. I was the grief-stricken old woman, traumatized by the terrible accident at what should have been a celebration. I let them believe I was weak and confused. I attended family dinners when invited, still smiled politely when they seated me in the corner like an unwanted guest. I let my daughter-in-law make little comments about my age, my health, my confusion about what had really happened that night. They thought they had won, that their plan had simply hit the wrong target, but that I was too old and addled to figure out the truth. But what they didn't know was that I was documenting everything. Every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of callous indifference. I had Richard's lab report sealed in an envelope with his signature and professional credentials. I had voice recordings of phone calls where my son had all but confessed. I had the original cake crumbs preserved in a sterile container. And I had witnesses, people who had seen how they treated me, who could testify to the pattern of emotional abuse that had been building for months. Every humiliation was now fuel for the fire I was building. The cruelty escalated as they grew more confident that I suspected nothing. One evening, I arrived at their home to find my usual seat at the dining table occupied by a large floral arrangement. My daughter-in-law glanced at me with a smirk that didn't even try to hide her malice. "Oh, Linda, you don't mind sitting at the children's table, do you?" she asked sweetly, motioning toward a small plastic table in the corner. It was the kind of table meant for toddlers, barely knee-high, with cartoon characters printed on the surface. The room burst into laughter. Not the uncomfortable laughter of people who recognize cruelty, but the genuine amusement of people who found my humiliation entertaining. My son didn't say a word to defend me. He didn't even look in my direction. I swallowed my pride, lowered myself carefully onto the tiny plastic chair, and forced a smile. My knees were practically touching my chin, and I had to eat with my arms bent at awkward angles. But inside, my heart whispered with cold certainty, "Not for long. Soon, you'll be the ones crawling on your knees, begging for mercy." Behind closed doors, I prepared for war. I met with Richard again, asking him to notarize his lab report and prepare additional copies for official use. I visited my lawyer, Harold Brennan, the same man who had handled my husband's estate and had known our family for decades. Quietly, we reviewed all the important documents: my will, my insurance policies, my bank accounts. We made copies of everything and secured them in multiple locations. Harold was shocked when I told him what had happened. "Linda, are you absolutely certain about this? It's a very serious accusation." I showed him the evidence, the lab report, the recordings, the timeline of events. His face grew grave as he reviewed each piece. "This is attempted murder," he said quietly. "You know that, don't you?" "Yes," I replied, my voice steady as stone. "I know exactly what it is." I even practiced what I would say when the moment came. Alone in my living room, I stood before the mirror, watching my reflection transform from victim to avenger. "You wanted me gone?" I rehearsed, my voice growing stronger with each repetition. "You thought this house, this money, this family legacy would be yours. Well, tonight, everyone will know the truth about who you really are." My reflection stared back at me. Older, yes, but not defeated. For the first time in years, I saw real fire in my own eyes. The meek, invisible widow was gone. In her place stood a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The final straw came the week before Thanksgiving. My son called me on a Tuesday evening, his tone businesslike and cold. "Mom, maybe you shouldn't come this year. We just don't have the space." Didn't have space. In the same house where I'd helped them host dozens of gatherings over the years. The same house where I'd cooked Thanksgiving dinner myself for the first 5 years after they moved in. "We're planning something special this year," he continued. "And it's really just for immediate family." Immediate family. As if I was some distant relative, some obligation they'd finally found an excuse to shed. I sat there in silence, my fingers gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. 43 years of Thanksgivings, 43 years of cooking, cleaning, shopping, planning. And now I wasn't even immediate family. "Of course, dear," I said softly, playing my role one final time. "I understand completely." But inside, the last piece of my heart that had still hoped for redemption crumbled into dust. The decision crystallized in that moment with perfect clarity. The stage was set. The evidence was gathered. The plan was ready. At the next family gathering, and there would be a next gathering because narcissists can never resist an audience, I would deliver a revelation so devastating that they would never recover. They thought they had buried me, but they had made a fatal error. They forgot that when you try to bury a seed, it doesn't die. It grows. The night of the family dinner finally arrived. It was a pre-Thanksgiving celebration, they'd told the extended family. A chance for everyone to get together before the actual holiday. Of course, I hadn't been invited to this either, but I'd made my own arrangements. My son and daughter-in-law had filled their house with guests, his work colleagues, her family, their neighbors, everyone who mattered to them, everyone they wanted to impress with their perfect life and their perfect family. I walked in slowly, uninvited but not unwelcome. They couldn't afford to make a scene in front of their guests. I was hunched over my cane, dressed in plain gray, looking every inch the harmless old woman they believed me to be. They barely acknowledged my presence, too busy playing the role of the perfect hosts. "Linda, you made it," my daughter-in-law muttered through gritted teeth, her smile as fake as a $3 bill. Her voice carried just the right note of surprised politeness for their guests to hear. "Of course, dear," I replied sweetly. "I wouldn't miss spending time with family." The word family hung in the air like a challenge. She was already turning back to her friends before I'd finished speaking, dismissing me as if I were a piece of furniture. They seated me at the far corner of the table, half hidden behind a large centerpiece, as though they were ashamed I was even there. I sat quietly, enduring every small insult, every dismissive gesture, every moment of calculated cruelty. But this time, I wasn't just enduring. I was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment when everyone would be watching, when their humiliation would be complete and public. The dinner conversation flowed around me like I wasn't even present. They talked about their successful careers, their investment properties, their exotic vacation plans. When someone asked about me, my son waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, Mom's just getting older, you know. She gets confused sometimes." The guests nodded sympathetically, their eyes filled with pity for this poor old woman losing her faculties. If only they knew how sharp my mind really was, how carefully I'd been planning this moment. When dessert was about to be served, an elaborate tiramisu that had probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, I stood slowly. My cane tapped once against the hardwood floor, the sound cutting through the chatter like a knife. The conversation died instantly, all eyes turning to the elderly woman in the corner. "I have something to share," I announced, my voice steady and clear. My son's face went pale. He'd heard that tone before, years ago when he was a child caught in a lie. "Mom, sit down," he said quickly, his voice tight with warning. "Don't make this about—" "Oh, but I will," I cut him off, my voice ringing with authority I hadn't used in decades. The entire room fell silent, sensing the shift in atmosphere. From my handbag, I pulled out a manila envelope, sealed with official tape. "This," I said, holding it up for everyone to see, "is a certified laboratory report." I broke the seal with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment. "It confirms that the cake my son sent me for my 70th birthday wasn't spoiled by accident." Gasps rippled through the room. My daughter-in-law's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. "It was deliberately poisoned, with enough toxic substance to kill an elderly person with health conditions." The silence was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear someone's sharp intake of breath. "And here," I continued, pulling out a second document, "is a handwriting analysis performed by a certified forensic expert." My son was shaking his head, his mouth moving soundlessly. The words "Happy Birthday, Linda" written on that cake, confirmed to be written by my son, my own flesh and blood. Whispers erupted around the table. Guests pushed back from their seats, staring at my son and daughter-in-law with horror and disbelief. Some covered their mouths in shock, others reached for their phones. "Mom, this is insane." My son finally found his voice, stammering desperately. It was just a mistake." "A mistake," I thundered, my voice shaking the crystal glasses on the table. "A mistake that nearly killed your mother-in-law when she ate the slice meant for me?" I pulled out my phone, holding it up for everyone to see. "A mistake that you confirmed in this recorded phone conversation when you said, and I quote, 'Maybe it should have been you instead.'" I pressed play. My son's voice filled the room, tinny through the phone speaker but crystal clear. "Maybe it should have been you instead." The reaction was immediate and devastating. Several guests stood up abruptly, their chairs scraping against the floor. A woman I didn't recognize covered her mouth and ran toward the bathroom. My son's boss, I recognized him from office Christmas parties, stared at my son like he'd never seen him before. "You actually tried to kill your own mother?" someone whispered. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. "And when your plan failed," I continued relentlessly, "when an innocent woman nearly died in my place, you called it an accident." I looked around the room, making eye contact with each horrified face. But the most telling evidence of all is this: not once, in the days following that woman's collapse did either of them call to check on me. I let that sink in, watching the realization dawn on their faces. Not once did they ask if I was traumatized by watching someone nearly die at my birthday dinner. My voice grew stronger, more confident. Because they weren't concerned about my well-being. They were disappointed their plan had failed. Then I raised my hand toward the front door. "Officers, you can come in now." Two uniformed police officers stepped into the dining room, their presence making the space feel smaller and more dangerous. Behind them came Detective Sarah Martinez, a woman I'd spoken with extensively over the past week. The gasps turned into cries of disbelief. Several guests scrambled for the exit, not wanting to be present for what was clearly about to become a crime scene. My daughter-in-law bolted to her feet, her face twisted with panic and rage. You called the police!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You manipulative old witch! This is all lies!" "Yes," I said calmly, standing as tall as my 70-year-old spine would allow. "I called the police, and I gave them everything: the poison evidence, the forensic reports, the recorded confessions." I gestured to the officers with steady hands. "Tonight, your lies end. Tonight, everyone sees you for what you really are." Detective Martinez stepped forward, her voice professional and clear. "Thomas Williams, Jennifer Williams, you are both under arrest for attempted murder in the first degree and conspiracy to commit murder." The room erupted in chaos as the handcuffs clicked around their wrists. My daughter-in-law was sobbing now, her carefully applied makeup streaming down her face in black rivers. "This is insane," she wailed. "She's a crazy old woman. Nobody will believe her." My son tried one last desperate gambit. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice breaking like it had when he was 8 years old. "We can work this out. Family doesn't do this to family." I looked at him, this man I had raised, this stranger who had tried to murder me, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "You're right," I said quietly. "Family doesn't do this to family. But you stopped being my family the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive." Detective Martinez continued reading them their rights as chaos swirled around us. Guests were fleeing toward the exits, some crying, others frantically calling people on their phones. The perfect dinner party had become a crime scene. The perfect family had been exposed as monsters. As the police car pulled away with my son and daughter-in-law in the back seat, I stood on the front porch of the house I had helped them buy. The remaining guests streamed past me, avoiding eye contact, whispering among themselves. But a few stopped to speak to me. My son's boss approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Williams," he said quietly, "I just want you to know, if there's anything you need." He shook his head in disbelief. I never would have imagined. Thomas always seemed so normal. "Evil often does," I replied simply. The detective stayed behind to collect additional evidence and take statements from witnesses. As she worked, she spoke to me with genuine respect. "Ma'am, I have to say, the way you handled this investigation was impressive. You gathered evidence like a professional." I smiled, feeling oddly proud. I may be old, detective, but I'm not stupid. And I refuse to be a victim. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media attention, court appearances, and long overdue justice. The local news picked up the story. Elderly woman exposes son's murder plot. The headlines made me wince, but the vindication felt like sunlight after months in the dark. My son's mother-in-law, still recovering in the hospital, squeezed my hand when I visited her. "You saved my life," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "No, dear," I replied, squeezing gently. "I saved mine." The preliminary hearing was packed with reporters and curious onlookers. I testified clearly and calmly, presenting my evidence piece by piece. The prosecutor called it one of the most thoroughly documented cases he'd ever seen. My son's defense attorney tried to paint me as a confused elderly woman seeking attention. But the evidence spoke for itself. The poison, the handwriting analysis, the recorded phone calls. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Walking through town now, people look at me differently. Not as a weak old woman to be pitied or ignored, but as someone who had survived the ultimate betrayal and turned it into justice. The grocery store clerk asks how I'm doing with genuine interest. My neighbors wave from their porches and actually stop to chat. At church, people seek me out to hear my story, to understand how I found the strength to fight back. I've become something I never expected to be at 70 years old, an inspiration. Young women tell me I give them hope for their own futures. Other elderly people say I've shown them they don't have to accept mistreatment from their families. My son and daughter-in-law received sentences of 15 years to life. They'll have plenty of time to think about their choices, about what they threw away for the promise of an early inheritance. Their house was sold to pay for legal fees. Their children, my grandchildren, are living with relatives who actually care about them. I've established a trust fund for their education because they shouldn't suffer for their parents' crimes. As for me, I'm living my life more fully than I have in years. I've joined a book club, started taking art classes, even began dating a widower from my church. Harold is a kind man who thinks my gray hair is beautiful and my wrinkles are proof of a life well lived. Every morning when I wake up in my own bed, in my own house, breathing free air, I'm grateful. Grateful not just to be alive, but to have discovered that I was stronger than I ever knew. They thought they were burying me when they tried to poison me on my 70th birthday. They thought I was weak, finished, ready to be discarded like yesterday's newspaper. But they forgot the most important truth about seeds. When you try to bury them, they don't die. They grow. They push up through the darkness, through the soil, through every obstacle, and when they finally break the surface, they're stronger than ever. I am 71 years old now, and I have never felt more alive. My son thought he was writing my epitaph with that poisoned birthday cake. Instead, he wrote his own. And now the whole world knows. You don't cross Linda Williams and walk away unscathed. If you thought tonight's revenge was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when my billionaire son asked if I was enjoying my $8K monthly allowance and my daughter-in-law froze when I told him I work 60 hours weekly. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow with another revenge story that will leave you speechless.